here this evening slash morning or wherever you are in your time zone throughout the world. And so like Uday said, my name is Mandisa Thomas. I'm the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, which was started here in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And I think it's important for us to have these conversations regarding race, discrimination, classism from a secular point of view. And one of the missions of my organization is, if whether you're in the United States or wherever you are, most communities of color, particularly within the Black community, are still very, very religious, whether it is through Christianity or through your, indigenous or native religion. And so this being an atheist does carry still a stigma for many of us, which can cause a number of barriers to engagement and working on issues that that we face in our communities. So it's important. It's also important to note that we tend to be a bit more honest and a bit more perceptive about societal issues, because we realize that there's no divine entity that's coming in to save us. We don't rely on that. So therefore, it's up to the people to do this work. And when it comes to education, when it comes to activism, and when it comes to community building. And so, this is one of the reasons why I think it's very important for us to continue to, mobilize and speak up and do the things that we do. And so, in speaking of the perils of racism, it isn't just in the United States. As Uday said, we're now seeing a global phenomenon of people standing together in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started in the particular Black Lives Matter movement was started in 2013, almost 10 years ago, about 7 years ago now. And this was in response to the ongoing, the ongoing murders of Black people at the hands of law enforcement, as well as wannabe law enforcement, people who want to be in law enforcement. And so what we're seeing now, especially with George Floyd, as he horrifically suffered a death by having a knee placed on his neck by a police officer for almost 9 minutes. This was just a combination of things that were happening, especially this year. So yes, we're in the midst of a huge worldwide epidemic with the COVID-19 virus, with the pandemic. And so, which has adversely and severely affected people of color, especially in the United States in particular. But there were also a number of murders that took place at the hands of law enforcement and former law enforcement. The first being Ahmaud Arbery back in February, who down in Brunswick, Georgia, was murdered by a former cop and his son under suspicion of being a burglar while he was jogging. So the father and son team, along with another white gentleman, basically hunted him down and shot him as he tried to defend himself. There was also Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, who was killed by police who were serving a no-knock warrant, and they were actually at the wrong place of residence. And so her voice and the incident surrounding her murder went largely unnoticed until recently. And so now we have the video of George Floyd, who was brutally murdered by law enforcement, which just ignited a new wave of protests, a new wave of activism, and people getting involved and showing their support and solidarity. Now, if you're a history buff like myself, you know that this isn't the first time that this has taken place, especially if you've been in the United States for a period of time. We've seen this happen time and time again. If you can remember back to the 1990s, when we saw Rodney King being brutally beaten by the Los Angeles Police Department, or members of the Los Angeles Police Department, and they were caught on video and they were found not guilty. And so, and also back to the Watts riots back in the 60s, and when there was uprisings once Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered. And so we're seeing a long history of protest and uprising against racist policies, racist practices, especially committed against the Black community and other communities of color. Now, we can start in America. We can actually start further back globally, because there have been many countries across the continent, India included, which has been affected and impacted by colonialization and white supremacy. There is no country throughout the world, probably with the exceptions of like Antarctica, that hasn't been impacted by white supremacy. And what has happened as racism was instituted in policies and laws was that it, it severely discriminated and disfranchised darker skinned people. And this has happened, like I said, throughout the world, as we see throughout in many countries, darker skinned people and darker skinned people of color have been routinely discriminated against, harassed, brutalized, and murdered. And so, and we see this in the United States. If you study the history of how the United States established itself, and also how it established classes of race, and how it was meant to basically subjugate the enslaved Africans and their descendants for a period of, initially for eternity. So when the enslaved Africans were brought to this country, to the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, it was meant that we were supposed to be enslaved and treated as subhumans forever. And this has also happened across the globe, wherever you have seen people of African descent. That we were supposed to be subjugated. Our ancestors were supposed to be subjugated for for eternity. But of course, as time changes, and as people realize that mistreatment of human beings is wrong, we have laws and policies that seek to eliminate that. But what has happened, because we have all been affected by this idea that that our colonizers, our conquerors were were superior to us. Not that not that all of us believe that, but because we were forced to believe it. And so once you're physically enforced to believe it, you're also conditioned to psychologically believe it. And so now, which has, like I said before, has been instituted into policies, it was instituted into laws, which effectively impacted communities of color and relegated many to very poor economic conditions, as well as subjugated us to the inability to effectively overcome them. Because once legal slavery ended in the United States, there was a period of Reconstruction where there was a lot of success in many Black communities and among many Black folks. But what happened there was terrorizing by groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, and also the implementation of Jim Crow laws, which enforced legal segregation and terrorizing folks into remaining in a place of underclass. So there was force in that, and this has been etched into the psyche of many people, many at the hands of law enforcement, who have been conditioned, whether it is through their upbringing, whether it is through policy, whether it is through law, to see darker skin and Black folks as being superior, as being inferior, and as being animals that need to be controlled. And so we see this in the constant mistreatment of, of people of color and Black folks by law enforcement and by other officials. And so as we see throughout time and history, folks get tired of that. People get tired of being mistreated. They get tired of being, oppressed. And this has certainly happened in, with the, there's the Indian Rebellion in 1857 against British rule, British colonialism. We've seen this in London as well, with the Brixton riots in the 1970s. We've seen this in the Boxer Rebellion in China, against British colonialization and the oppression there. And so again, this has severely impacted people of color globally for centuries. And I think that we would be remiss to think that this hasn't affected us internally and also how we treat each other. But what's happening now is that people are really starting to see these symbols of oppression across the world, because there have been monuments of enslavers and colonizers and brutalizers erected in areas where these people were, they were forever monumentalized as in infamy. For many of us, it's infamy. And so now, as we see this current movement, we're seeing a lot of people attempting to take them down, because now, we didn't get to this point of institutional and structural racism and oppression overnight. And so there is there needs to be understanding that there is severe and serious reform and changes that need to take place, both, in policy, and in, and also in our minds and how we see things throughout the world. And this is the problem. This has been the problem of racism and oppression and colonialism, because unfortunately it has made many of us complicit, even if it wasn't through intentional means. Now, as human beings, there's always been conflict. We can study this throughout the world, but I think we can all attest to and agree to the fact that it was exacerbated during colonial invasion and under colonial rules. And when you liberate people without giving the proper means to rebuild, ultimately you end up mirroring the oppressor. And so this is how systemic it becomes. It doesn't place the accountability where it properly belongs. And so now it's putting it in the hands of, it's up to the people who were oppressed to pull themselves out of it. And we didn't necessarily get ourselves into it. And so it's almost like punishing us twice. And so people, as we see, there are, again, many people who are beginning to understand that the mistreatment and the brutalization of Black folks has continued over the course of centuries, and generations. And there's a time where it has to stop. The harassment, the brutalization, and the mistreatment of darker people at the hands of white supremacist values and white supremacist principles has to stop. And so now we're seeing that, and hopefully, because there's always been a number of white people who have, opposed, they've been anti-slavery, they've been anti-oppression, they've been anti-colonialism, which is always good to note. But some of those same white people also have benefited from the privilege of never having to be hands-on or directly affected by these systems of oppression. And while many of us may not have ever we've experienced some sort of discrimination in our lifetime, especially if you've encountered white people. I think many of us have experienced that to some degree. Not to the degree of our ancestors, but it is still it still happens to be a byproduct of, you know, the racist principles and the racist practices that have gone on for centuries. And so as we go into this new, we're already in the new millennium. We're 20 years into the new millennium, and we're at the start of, you know, a new decade, and we're still seeing these things take place. And so hopefully now, with our, you know, with our access to information, with our ability to unite globally, because as we see these things happening, we can see these things in real time now. We can see these things happening in the United States, who prides itself, or who purports itself to be one of the greatest countries in the world. And I could, you know, of course, I think all of us could probably say that we are, you know, there are some other places where I think, you know, for us to be openly identified as atheists could mean our deaths. And we've also seen this in different countries where atheists have been arrested and have been tried and also have been killed as a result of their outspoken non-belief. But it's important for us to understand how the Judeo-Christian religions have been complicit in racist practices throughout the world, and that we have to continue to shed light on this. And it cannot be the elephant in the room conversation. So as I said before, as we have more access to information, as we have the ability to put these together and understand how they have had these effects on us for many, many years, it hopefully won't take centuries to undo this, because as people, we do have the ability, and we do have the ability and the power. We can take our power back, but we have to understand these, you know, these institutions that have been put in place, some that have been used to divide us. But what's happening now is that, you know, what's great about this now, especially for those of us who identify as atheists and non-believers, is that we can now connect with each other through the power of the internet and the web, which is amazing to see a number of people of color globally who are waking up to a lot of these oppressive regimes, a lot of these oppressive institutions that have affected us according to how we look and also how we think. So, and hopefully, you know, in the near future, we can continue to overturn, you know, this, you know, these problems that we've been facing, you know, across the globe. And again, it's good to see that there have been resistance movements across the world. I know there's been a number of them in the country of India. There certainly have been a number of them in the United States. We've seen the Black Panthers, you know, back in the 1960s. We've seen the Civil Rights Movement. We've seen other movements that have been created to mobilize people of color, not just mobilize, but empower us against our oppressors. And, you know, as we continue on into the future, hopefully we are continuing to educate ourselves and also helping build up our communities, helping people, you know, and helping overturn this tide that we are still dealing with. Because as we can see, and I'm pretty sure the circumstances may be similar even in your country or in your home countries, where law enforcement has had unfettered power to do what they want with the people in, you know, who they detain. You know, we've seen this, and the police and law enforcement in the United States in particular has been allowed to get away with this for a long period of time, even against fellow police officers of color, especially Black police officers, who've even had to endure racism and racist practices within, the institution that they serve. So it has been, those effects have been long reaching, They have been long lasting and effective. And now the people are, we're tired. And we're tired of this idea that, well, there's going to be some savior that comes in and helps us through this, that there's going to be some God, whoever that may be, whatever God people believe in, is actually going to come in and save us. And that has never been the case. It has always been up to the people, even those who do believe in in God. There have been many of us who have fought against human subjugation and human oppression. So hopefully those who still believe are now, hopefully those beliefs are compelling them to get active and get involved. And there's more than one way to do that. So as we're seeing global protests, even in the wake of the pandemic. And we hope that people are staying safe. If you are among those who are, if you are among those who are protesting out in the streets and out in the public square, we hope that you are remaining safe, because we don't want you to get sick and be affected by this virus. So, but as you do that, please do know that people are seeing you, we're hearing you, and we support you. Of course, there are other ways to do that. If you are not the type of person who protests, you can certainly donate to organizations that support protesters. There are a number of organizations that have bail funds for people who have been arrested as a result of protesting. There are people who provide other resources, especially community building. As there are calls now to reform and defund the police, which doesn't mean defund altogether, but certainly defund the parts that allow a law enforcement to treat the civilians as if they're in a war zone, as if they are completely the enemy. And this is where a lot of law enforcement, a lot of police, a lot of police departments have, these military tactic style weapons, primarily against unarmed people, and we've seen this again throughout the world. We've also seen this in South Africa during the Soweto uprisings, where, the South African police were brutally gunning down students. So there has been, again, this is a part of the history where we see the powers that be exercising unnecessarily brutal force against civilians. So there is a call now to defund those efforts on behalf of law enforcement, which they should be. Because when you have a system that ultimately looks at human beings, especially darker human beings, as if we are animals, or if we don't have the right to exist, well, then this continues. But then what happens? People continue to fight back. And so as we are continuing to, and there are multiple ways to do that, which is basically the point that I'm making. There are a number of ways that we can fight back, whether it is through getting more involved in your local politics, because now there's no physical barriers to people voting, at least in more developed countries. There's no more physical barriers, or there's no more there isn't those clear lines of people being unable to run for office and being unable to do these things. But there are, because we still have those biases and those practices in place, it is still difficult, especially for Black folks in the United States. And this does not mitigate people, and because as I said in the beginning, darker skinned folks have suffered throughout the world at the hands of white supremacy. So we've seen this as a global phenomenon. We are not alone in this. So, and then also supporting your organizations who are representing us, such as the organization that has put this on. organizations like Black Nonbelievers that work to uplift the Black atheist, Black secular voices, as well as highlight our activism and what we do in the United States. And as we collaborate and connect with other activists across the world, because that's been the one gratifying thing about doing this work, is connecting with other global organizations and other global organizations of color that are mobilizing. And because we have predominantly been the ones most affected by religious oppression and white supremacist rule. And so which negates the idea that we've just accepted our suffering. That has never been the case. And so as we see this come around now, it's important to be strategic. It's important to be, it's important for us to work together on these issues so that we can continue to uplift our communities, uplift our people, and keep people safe, and make sure that our children don't have to go through this, or they have better tools to fight it. Because am I optimistic that this can be overturned? I won't say ended, because human conflict will never end. Human conflict in general just will never end. But am I optimistic that it doesn't have to go to the levels that we've seen them before? Yes. Because again, as we see as we see the world respond, and we're seeing people from different backgrounds respond to this, we're now seeing people understand where they didn't before. Whereas, their privilege or lack of knowledge is now compelling them to understand and learn about what has been going on throughout the world, and certainly what has been going on in these United States, in which the current administration would have you believe that we're just this perfect country, and many of us can tell you that it is not. And so, for those folks who are here in the United States, can attest to, wherever you are in your, wherever your connections are throughout the world. This is just one of the many ways that we are looking to overturn these oppressive practices. And because the originators of them are long gone, the original colonizers are long gone, but unfortunately, again, the policies and practices are not. And so getting to the root of those problems, getting to the root and understanding that this isn't just an isolated moment in time, that it has been a buildup and a cycle of resistance and rebellion that has taken place over years. But as we now have better means of understanding, learning, and working together, I am confident that more of us can use the power that we know we have to overturn this, and not just unite, but really work together on these issues here. Because many of us, even if some of the policies are a bit different, much of what we go through is very similar. And as human beings, I am confident that we can recognize our humanity, many of us, regardless of how we identify, whether we are Black or other people of color, whether we are the LGBTQ community. And I've been doing some research on the Dravidian movement and how it is an equal rights movement, because I know culturally and historically in India, I know the rights for women, just as across the globe, women's rights have been a thing that people have had to fight for. So and that cannot be lost in this struggle as well. The rights of women, the rights of the LGBTQ community, the rights for people of color, the rights for children. All of our voices matter, and all of our voices deserve to be heard. And as more of us continue to make that presence known, and the more we mobilize and the more we build, we can't be ignored forever. We haven't been ignored, but now is a time where our struggles and our work is really coming to the forefront. And so now we're at a point where people are listening, and not just listening, but they're understanding, and they want to know how they can get involved and do the work. And it's gonna take consistency, because the road can be long, the road can be hard, it can be difficult. And when we're dealing with our fellow human beings, we realize that at times at times it can be very difficult for us to pull together, and it shouldn't always be under extenuating circumstances, or circumstances where we are being oppressed, or where we see that glaring moment where someone is dying on video for us to get active, because it's going to take that structural change, and when people aren't looking. So continuing to remain involved, continuing to stay active, continuing to reassess ourselves, and how we see each other and how we work together is really going to make a huge difference. And like I said, I'm very, very happy to connect, especially with people of color across the globe, who are recognizing their humanity and their humanist principles, especially without that belief in that divine entity, or that divine being. We're also working to destigmatize, not just humanism, but atheism, because and I strongly advocate for people to to say that they're atheists. As much as they can. Of course, there are some who cannot, because it can mean people's livelihoods, and like I said before, it could you also carry the risk of death still in certain countries. And so as we work to turn this around, the more we become aware, the more we become active, and the more we work together and pool our resources together, I am confident that moving forward, that this won't just be another cycle. This won't just be another news cycle. This won't just be something that is a passing fade or passing fad, and then a few years later, we're going through this again. Now is a time, with the resources that we have and our ability to connect, to really move this, to really move this forward, and to really unite, and really, and to really give, give some fire to this. And so, yes, there is, Black is a symbol of revolution, Black power, and of course, power to, to all people of color, especially all darker skinned people across the world, because there is fear in us having that power. There is fear in all of us uniting and getting together and understanding the oppression that we have been, that we have been subjected to, and that we've endured. And so, yes, we have a right to be angry. We have a right to, there's a right to rebel. And so, and the more we educate ourselves, the more we educate each other, people are going to get angry, and that's okay. But let's use that anger. Let's use let's harness that power to really, really put forth some new policies, and policies that uplift everyone. And again, to recognize, and not just recognize, but uplift each other in our humanity. Even for those who still subscribe to a belief in God, that is your human right to do. But for those of us who don't, and we see things from a more practical standpoint, it is important for us to continue to do that, so that we can move forward and into the future, and make this, and just basically make this world a better place for all of us. And I think that that's something that we all want, and that's something that we're all striving for. So thank you very much, for having me. I know this could easily be a conversation that takes place for a few hours, but just getting to, hopefully it's also another starting point to seeing what's going on globally, what's going on in communities of color, especially amongst Black folks who are who are either fully atheists, and who are letting go of this God concept, because it is happening here. So thank you all very much for tuning in this morning, or this evening, or wherever you are.
உங்களுக்கு இந்த வீடியோ பிடிச்சிருந்தா லைக் பண்ணுங்க, கமெண்ட் பண்ணுங்க, ஷேர் பண்ணுங்க. மேலும் எங்கள் வீடியோஸை பார்க்க எங்கள் சேனலை சப்ஸ்கிரைப் பண்ணுங்கள். மறந்துடாமல் பெல் பட்டனை ப்ரெஸ் பண்ணுங்கள்.